I was 16 when my mother brought him home, a man with eyes like storm clouds and a smile that seemed to hide more than it revealed. His name was Viktor, and he arrived on a rainy afternoon, his coat dripping onto the hardwood floor of our cramped little house. My mother had met him at the diner where she waitressed, and after months of hushed phone calls and late-night shifts, she decided he was the one to fill the empty space my father had left behind. She didn't ask my opinion, never did, just announced it over dinner one night, her voice bright with a hope I hadn't heard in years. "Viktor's moving in," she said, slicing into a meatloaf that was more breadcrumb than meat. "He's good for us, Clara. You'll see." I nodded, because that's what I always did when she decided something. But I watched him from across the table, his broad hands folded neatly, his gaze flickering toward me for just a moment too long. It wasn't a look I could name then, but it settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. The first weeks were quiet. Viktor was polite, almost too polite, helping with dishes or fixing the leaky faucet my mother had ignored for months. He'd talk about his old job as a carpenter, his deep voice filling the room with stories of wood grain and sawdust. I'd listen from the doorway, half interested, half wary. My mother glowed around him, her laughter louder, her steps lighter. I wanted to be happy for her, but something about Viktor made my skin prickle, like when you hear a sound in the dark and can't tell if it's the wind or something closer. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd been up late, sketching in my room, when I heard footsteps outside my door. Not my mother's soft shuffle, but a heavier tread. The knob turned, slow and deliberate, and there he was, the Viktor, framed in the dim light from the hall. He didn't step inside, just stood there, his face unreadable. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice low. "Saw your light on. You're always drawing, aren't you?" I clutched my sketchbook to my chest, nodding. "Yeah. Helps me think." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're a quiet one, Clara. I like that. We should talk more." Before I could answer, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the next day, he started finding reasons to be near me, asking about my drawings, offering to drive me to school, lingering when my mother wasn't around. Each time, his eyes held that same unnameable weight, and I began to wonder if I was imagining it. I wasn't. The days blurred into a strange rhythm after that night. Viktor's presence grew heavier, like a fog rolling in off the coast, silent but impossible to ignore. My mother didn't seem to notice. She'd hum while cooking breakfast, her apron dusted with flour, oblivious to the way his gaze drifted toward me when she turned her back. I started avoiding the kitchen, but it was no use, he'd find me anyway. One evening, I was rinsing dishes alone, the house quiet except for the patter of rain against the windows. My mother had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I heard the floor creak behind me and knew it was him before I turned. Viktor leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that half-smile I'd come to dread. "You're good at that," he said, nodding at the sink. "Helping out. Your mother's lucky to have you." I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the soapy water. "Somebody's got to do it." He stepped closer, too close, and I felt the air shift. "You don't talk much, Clara, but I can tell you're thinking all the time. What's on your mind?" I gripped a plate tighter, my knuckles whitening. "Just school. Homework." He laughed softly, a sound that didn't match the tension in the room. "You're a bad liar." "That's okay, I like a mystery." I turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. They were darker than usual, like the rain had seeped into them. "I should go to bed," I said, stepping past him. He didn't stop me, but his fingers brushed my arm as I went, light as a whisper, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my sketchbook. Plain paper, folded once, with my name in his jagged handwriting. Inside, just 2 words, "You're enough." I stared at it, my stomach twisting. What did it mean? Was it an apology? A compliment? I tore it up and threw it in the trash, but the words stuck with me, burrowing into my thoughts like splinters. That afternoon, I decided to tell my mother. She was folding laundry in the living room, her hands moving fast, her face tired but content. I sat across from her, the words tangled in my throat. "Mom," I started, "Victor's been weird lately." She paused, a sock dangling from her hand. "Weird how?" "He's always around me. Watching. Last night, he came into the kitchen when I was alone." Her brow furrowed, but then she smiled. "Oh, honey, he's just trying to get to know you. He's not used to kids, give him time." I wanted to argue, to tell her about the note, the footsteps, the way his eyes made me feel trapped. But her smile was so fragile, so desperate for this to work, that I swallowed it all down. "Yeah," I said. "Maybe." She went back to folding, and I went back to my room, locking the door for the first time in years. But that night, I heard it again, those heavy steps, pausing just outside. And then, faintly, a sigh. The weeks that followed felt like a game I didn't know the rules to. Victor's attention sharpened, but he kept it subtle, small gestures, quiet words, things my mother could dismiss as kindness. A cup of tea left on the table when I studied late. A book about sketching slipped onto my shelf, no note, just his handwriting on the inside cover, for Clara. I'd catch him watching me from the yard while I read on the porch, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. Each time, I'd look away, pretending not to notice, but my skin would crawl. One Saturday, he came home with a package wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. My mother was at the diner, pulling a double shift, and the house felt too big without her. He set it on the kitchen table, his eyes bright with something I couldn't place. "Got you something," he said, nudging it toward me. "Go on, open it." I hesitated, the twine rough under my fingers. "You didn't have to get me anything." "I wanted to," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "You deserve nice things." Inside was a wooden box, polished to a gleam, with a tiny lock and key. It was beautiful, the kind of thing I'd sketch in my wilder dreams, but holding it made my chest tighten. "It's nice," I managed. "Thanks." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "It's for your drawings. Keep them safe. Private." The way he said private lingered, heavy and deliberate. I nodded, forcing a smile, and took the box to my room. I didn't touch it again that day, leaving it on my desk like an uninvited guest. That night, I woke to a soft tapping, rain, I thought, until I realized it was too rhythmic. It was coming from the box. I sat up, heart racing, and stared at it in the dark. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, and I told myself I'd imagined it. The next morning, I found the key missing. I'd left it on my nightstand, but it was gone. I tore my room apart, under the bed, in drawers, behind the curtains, but nothing. When I asked Victor at breakfast, casually, he tilted his head. "Lost it already," he said, sipping his coffee. "That's a shame. I'll look for it later." His tone was light, but his eyes weren't. I didn't push it. Instead, I started carrying my sketchbook everywhere, afraid to leave it in the box, afraid of what he might do if he found a way in. My drawings were mine, my thoughts, my escape. The idea of him seeing them made me sick. That afternoon, I saw something odd. Out my window, Victor was in the yard, digging near the old oak tree. He buried something small, patting the dirt smooth before glancing up. Our eyes met, and he waved, like it was nothing. I waved back, my hand trembling. What was he hiding? I didn't dare ask, but the question gnawed at me, growing sharper with every step he took closer to the house. The buried thing haunted me. I'd lie awake, imagining what Victor had hidden under that oak, something small enough to fit in his hand, something he didn't want seen. I couldn't ask my mother, she'd laugh it off or worse, tell him I'd been spying. So I watched him instead, noting how he'd linger near the tree some evenings, staring at the ground like it held a secret he wasn't ready to share. Then came the day I found the key. It was under my pillow, cold and gleaming, as if it had been waiting for me. I hadn't put it there, I was sure of it. My door had been locked all night, and yet there it was. I turned it over in my fingers, dread pooling in my stomach. Had Viktor been in my room? The thought made me dizzy, but I couldn't prove it. Not yet. I decided to test the box. In my room, door locked, I slid the key into the lock and turned. It clicked open smoothly, revealing a velvet-lined interior, empty, except for a faint scratch inside the lid. I squinted, tracing it with my finger, CV. My initials. Or, his. Clara Viktor. The coincidence chilled me. I shut the box and hid it under my bed, promising myself I'd confront him later. But later never came easy in that house. That night, I heard voices downstairs, my mother's, sharp and brittle, and Viktor's, low and steady. I crept to the stairs, peering through the banister. They stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, his hands raised like he was calming a storm. "You're imagining things, Ellen," he said. "I'm here for you. For both of you." "Then why's she so jumpy?" my mother snapped. "Clara's not herself lately." "She's a teenager," he replied, his voice smooth as glass. "They get like that." I shrank back, guilt and anger twisting inside me. She'd noticed, but she didn't see. Not really. When I slipped back to my room, I found my door ajar. I'd locked it, I always did now. My sketchbook was still on my desk, but the pages felt wrong, like they'd been touched. I flipped through them, heart pounding. Nothing was missing, but the edges were creased, faintly smudged. The next day, I stayed late at school, avoiding home until the sky bruised purple. When I got back, Viktor was waiting in the living room, alone. My mother's apron hung on the hook, she was at work again. "Long day?" he asked, patting the couch beside him. I stayed by the door. "Yeah. Homework." He nodded, then stood, crossing the room in 3 slow steps. "You're careful, Clara." "I like that. But you don't have to be, not with me." I forced a smile, my hand on the knob. "I'm tired. Good night." He didn't follow, but as I climbed the stairs, I heard him murmur something, soft, almost tender. "Soon," he said. I locked my door twice that night, checking the windows too. But when I woke, the box was on my desk again, key in the lock, open. Inside was a single sketch, mine, one I'd never shown anyone. A girl running, her face blurred. That sketch in the box undid me. I'd drawn it months ago, a private thing, scribbled in a fit of restless fear after a nightmare. I'd tucked it into an old journal, buried under clothes in my closet, nowhere Viktor could have found it. Yet there it was, staring up from that velvet lining, the girl's blurred face somehow sharper, like someone had traced it. I tore it to pieces, hands shaking, and stuffed the box back under my bed. But the question gnawed at me, how? I started watching him closer than he watched me. At breakfast, I'd catch the way his fingers lingered on the coffee mug, the way he'd pause mid-sentence when my mother mentioned my father. She didn't talk about Dad much, he'd left when I was 6, a shadow I barely remembered, but Viktor's eyes would narrow, just for a second, like he knew more than he let on. Then came the photograph. I found it slipped into my sketchbook one afternoon, wedged between pages I hadn't touched in weeks. It was old, edges yellowed, showing a young woman with my mother's sharp cheekbones and my dark hair. She stood by a tree, not our oak, but close enough to make my pulse jump. On the back, in faded ink, Ellen and V, 98. My mother's name. Viktor's initial. 1998, 2 years before I was born. I hid it in my sock drawer, my mind racing. Had they known each other before? She'd never mentioned it, always said she met him at the diner last year. I wanted to ask her, but she'd been distant lately, her shifts longer, her smiles thinner. Viktor was always there instead, filling the house with his quiet, heavy presence. That night, I waited until they were asleep and crept downstairs. The kitchen was dark, but I knew where she kept her old photo albums, top shelf, behind the cookbooks. I pulled one down, dust tickling my nose, and flipped through it. Nothing. No Viktor, no tree, no proof. I was about to give up when a loose picture fell out, a younger Viktor, arm around my mother, both laughing. Same tree. Same date on the back. My breath caught. Why had she lied? I slid the photo into my pocket and tiptoed back upstairs, but halfway up, the floor creaked behind me. I turned, and there he was, though Viktor, in his robe, eyes glinting in the dark. Looking for something? He asked, voice soft but edged. I clutched the album tighter. Just couldn't sleep. He stepped closer, and I saw it, a flicker of something raw in his face, not anger, but hunger. You're curious, Clara. That's good. But some things are better left alone. I nodded, bolting to my room, locking the door. The photo burned in my pocket, a puzzle piece I didn't want to fit. The next morning, he acted like nothing happened, but at breakfast, he slid a new sketch across the table, one I hadn't drawn. It was me, asleep, hair spilled across the pillow. Underneath, in his handwriting, beautiful. That sketch of me asleep twisted everything. I couldn't eat breakfast, my stomach churning as Viktor watched me over his coffee, his smile too calm, too knowing. My mother chattered about her shift, oblivious to the paper trembling in my hand. I mumbled an excuse and fled to my room, locking the door, the sketch crumpled in my fist. Who had drawn it? Him? When? The thought of him standing over me while I slept made my skin crawl. I stopped sleeping after that, or tried to. I'd sit up with my desk lamp on, sketchbook open but blank, listening for his steps. They came every night now, slow, deliberate, pausing outside my door. Sometimes he'd linger, sometimes he'd move on, but once, I swear I heard him whisper my name. Clara, soft as a breath, slipping through the crack beneath the door. I told myself it was the wind, but the house was still. The photographs wouldn't leave me alone either. I'd stare at them, of Viktor and my mother, younger, happier, a life she'd never told me about. I needed answers, so I cornered her one morning while he was out fixing the shed. She was at the sink, scrubbing a pan, her shoulders hunched. Mom, I said, holding up the photo from the album. Who's this? She froze, water dripping from her hands. Where'd you get that? Found it. Is this Viktor? From before? She snatched it from me, her face paling. That's old, Clara. Doesn't matter now. But you said you met him last year. This says 98. She turned away, drying her hands on a towel. People lose touch. We did. Then we found each other again. That's all. Her voice cracked, and I knew she was lying. Why didn't you tell me? Because it's complicated, she snapped, then softened. Please, honey. Let it go. I didn't. That night, I searched his things. He'd left his coat on the couch, and while my mother slept, I rifled through the pockets. Lint, a receipt, then, a folded letter, worn thin. It was addressed to my mother, dated 2001, the year after I was born. Ellen, I can't do this. She's yours now. Forgive me. Via my breath stopped. She's yours? Who? I heard the back door creak open. Viktor, home early. I shoved the letter back and darted upstairs, but not before his shadow fell across the hall. He didn't call out, just stood there, watching me climb. In my room, I hid the photographs under my mattress, my mind spinning. Was he talking about me? Had he known me as a baby? The next day, he left something new on my desk, a locket, silver and scratched, with a tiny clasp. Inside, a photo of a baby, dark-haired, nameless. No note, just the locket, cold in my palm. I locked it in the box, key hidden this time, but when I checked later, the box was open again, the locket gone. And on my pillow, a single word scratched into the wood of my headboard, mine. That word carved into my headboard, mine, stole what little piece I had left. I covered it with a pillow, but it burned in my mind, a claim I couldn't unsee. Viktor's games were growing bolder, and I was running out of places to hide. The locket's disappearance gnawed at me too. Who was that baby? Me? Someone else? The letter I'd found hinted at a past he and my mother shared, a past she wouldn't explain, and I was done waiting for her to crack. The house had an attic, a narrow hatch I'd never climbed into. My mother said it was full of junk, old furniture, boxes from before I was born, but Viktor spent time up there, claiming he was organizing. I'd hear the ladder creak some nights, his footsteps overhead while I lay awake. If he was hiding something, it'd be there. I waited until they both left, her to the diner, him to the hardware store. The hatch was stiff, but I pried it open, dust raining down as I hauled myself up. The attic smelled of mildew and time, lit only by a grimy window. Boxes lined the walls, some labeled Ellen, others unmarked. I started with those, tearing through faded letters, tax forms, nothing useful, until I found a small trunk, padlocked shut. I didn't have the key, but the lock was rusted. A hammer from Viktor's toolbox downstairs did the trick, splintering the wood enough to lift the lid. Inside, a jumble of papers, a man's watch, and a journal, leather-bound, edges frayed. The first page stopped me cold, for Clara, when she's ready. My mother's handwriting. I flipped through it, hard hammering. Entries from 1999, 2000, 2001, before and after I was born. Viktor's gone again. Says he can't stay, not with her here. Then, later, she looks like him sometimes. I can't tell him. My hands shook. Was she talking about me? I kept reading, but the floor creaked below, the ladder. Someone was coming. I shoved the journal into my waistband and scrambled to the hatch. Viktor's head appeared, his eyes locking onto mine before I could retreat. Clara, he said, voice eerily calm. What are you doing up here? Looking for old sketchpads, I lied, edging toward the ladder. He climbed up, blocking my path. Find anything interesting? No, I said, too fast. He stepped closer, and I saw it, a key dangling from his neck, small and silver. The box key? The trunk key? I didn't ask, just bolted past him, nearly falling down the ladder. He didn't chase me, but his laughter followed, low and chilling. That night, I read more of the journal in secret. One entry, dated my first birthday, he came back today. Saw her. Said she's his. I can't let him take her. I slammed it shut, my breath shallow. Take me? From where? The attic had given me answers, but they only birthed more questions, and downstairs, I heard the hatch creak open again. The attic hatch creaking open again that night sent me into a panic. I shoved the journal under my mattress, grabbed a chair, and wedged it against my door, my breath ragged in the silence. Footsteps climbed the ladder, slow, deliberate, but they didn't come down the hall. Instead, I heard a faint thud overhead, then nothing. Whatever Viktor was doing up there, he wasn't coming for me. Not yet. The journal stayed with me all the next day, hidden in my backpack at school. I read it in stolen moments, between classes, under the bleachers, piecing together a story that felt like a stranger's life. My mother wrote about Viktor leaving after I was born, about fights over money, over me. He thinks she's his reason to stay, but I won't let her be his cage, one entry said. Another, months later, he's gone for good. I hope. But he wasn't gone. He was here, now, carving words into my headboard, drawing me asleep. I needed to know more, but my mother was a locked vault, and Viktor was a shadow I couldn't outrun. Then, at lunch, my phone buzzed, a number I didn't know. I answered, hesitant. Clara? A woman's voice, rough with age. You don't know me, but I know you. Who is this? I whispered, ducking into the bathroom for privacy. Name's Ruth. I worked with your dad, or the man Ellen called your dad. Listen, kid, you're in trouble. My throat tightened. What do you mean? Victor's not who he says. He's been looking for you since you were a baby. Ellen thought she could hide you, but he's found you now. I gripped the phone, the tiles cold under my feet. Hide me? From what? A long pause. He thinks you're his. Not just his stepdaughter, his blood. Ellen never told him the truth. The line crackled, her voice fading. Ruth? What truth? Ask her about the hospital. The day you were born. I've gotta go, be careful, Clara. She hung up, leaving me staring at the screen, my pulse hammering. Victor, my father? No, my dad was a vague memory, a man who'd walked out. But Ruth's words fit too well with the journal, with the letter I'd found. I had to confront my mother. When I got home, Victor was in the yard, sharpening a shovel by the oak. He waved, the blade glinting, and I hurried inside. My mother was at the stove, stirring soup, her face drawn. Mom, I said, voice shaking. We need to talk. About Victor. About me. She dropped the spoon, broth splashing. Not now, Clara. Yes, now. Who's my real father? Her eyes widened, then darted to the window, toward Victor. Before she could answer, the phone rang, shrill and insistent. She grabbed it, listened, and went pale. He's coming inside, she whispered, hanging up. Hide that journal. Now. My mother's whispered warning, hide that journal, sent me scrambling. I shoved it under my mattress again, my hands trembling as the back door slammed open downstairs. Victor's boots thudded on the floor, each step a countdown. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My mother grabbed my arm, her grip tight, and pulled me toward the living room. Sit, she hissed, pushing me onto the couch. Don't say a word. Victor entered, dirt streaked on his hands, the shovel leaning against the wall behind him. He smiled, but it was thin, stretched too tight. Evening, ladies, he said, wiping his palms on his jeans. What's cooking? Soup, my mother replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Clara's helping me tonight. He nodded, glancing at me. Good. Family time. I sat rigid, Ruth's call echoing in my head, he thinks you're his blood. My mother's silence screamed louder than words. Victor settled into the armchair, watching us, and I knew this was my last chance. I couldn't wait anymore. Mom, I said, loud enough to cut through the tension. Tell me about the hospital. The day I was born. Her face crumpled, a gasp escaping before she could catch it. Victor's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. What's this about, Clara? Something I heard, I said, staring at my mother. From Ruth. She flinched, Ruth's name hit her like a slap. Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Ruth, huh? What's that old hag saying now? Enough, my mother snapped, turning to me. Clara, stop. No, I said, standing. You've lied to me. Both of you. Is he my father? The room went still, the air thick with unspoken things. Victor's gaze shifted to my mother, dark and unreadable. She covered her mouth, tears welling, then dropped her hands. He's not, she whispered. Your father was someone else. Victor and I, we were together before you. He left when I got pregnant. I told him it wasn't his. Victor stood, towering over us. But it could have been, Ellen. You never let me near her to find out. Because you're sick, she shouted, voice breaking. You came back obsessed, watching her, drawing her. I saw the sketches, Victor. I stepped back, my mind reeling. Not his daughter, but he'd wanted me to be. All this, the notes, the gifts, the stares, it wasn't love. It was something twisted, something he'd built in his head. Then who's my father? I asked, voice small. My mother sank onto the couch, sobbing. A man I met after Victor left. He stayed a year, then ran. I let Viktor think you were his, to keep him away. But he came back anyway. Viktor laughed, bitter and sharp. And now I'm here. For her. He stepped toward me, but my mother lunged, shoving him back. Run, Clara, she yelled. I bolted for the door, heart pounding, as the shovel clattered to the floor behind me. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and the house was a blur behind me. My mother's scream, "Run, Clara," echoed in my ears, drowning out Viktor's heavy steps. I stumbled into the woods behind our yard, branches clawing at my arms, until I collapsed near a stream, gasping. The night was cold, but my mind was colder, spinning with my mother's confession. Viktor wasn't my father. He'd wanted me anyway, in a way that turned love into something dark and wrong. I stayed there, hidden by the trees, until the sky lightened. When I crept back, the house was silent, the back door ajar. Inside, the living room was a wrecked couch overturned, soup spilled across the floor. No Viktor, no Mom. Just the shovel, propped against the wall, dirt caked on its edge. My stomach dropped. The oak tree. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, the beam trembling as I reached the spot where Viktor had dug before. The earth was disturbed again, fresher now, a mound of soil piled beside a shallow hole. I dropped to my knees, clawing at it, dread choking me. My fingers hit something hard, a box, not the wooden one he'd given me, but metal, rusted shut. I pried it open, dirt crumbling away. Inside, a bundle of letters, a man's ring, and a photo, my mother, younger, holding a baby. Me. But the letters weren't from Viktor. They were signed Daniel, my real father's name, according to her. One read, "Ellen, I can't stay. He knows. Keep her safe." Another, dated days later, "If Viktor finds out she's not his, he'll never stop." My mother hadn't lied about Viktor leaving, but she'd hidden why. Then I heard it, a rustle behind me. I turned, a flashlight swinging, and there was Viktor, his face bruised, blood on his shirt. "You found it," he said, voice hoarse. "I buried it for you." "Where's Mom?" I demanded, clutching the box. "Inside," he said, stepping closer. "She fought me. She's fine, just resting." I backed away, the stream at my heels. "You're not my father," she told me. He froze, then smiled, a terrible, broken thing. "I know. I've always known. Daniel took her from me, took you. I came back to make it right." "Make what right?" I shouted, shaking. "You're insane." "No," he said, reaching for me. "I'm your family. Blood or not." I swung the box, catching his jaw. He staggered, and I ran, sprinting to the house. My mother was on the floor, groggy but alive, a gash on her temple. "Clara," she mumbled, "the phone." I dialed 911, sobbing as I held her. The police came fast, lights flashing, and found Viktor by the oak, staring at the hole. He didn't fight them. Later, they dug deeper, and found bones. Human. Daniel's, they guessed, from years ago. Viktor had killed him, buried him, and waited. For me. My mother held me as we watched them take him away. "I thought I could fix it," she whispered. "I was wrong."